Well, this week we've been talking about the issue of sexual immorality and or any kind of immorality at that part on that point. As I pointed out for the last couple of days, that you can really kind of apply this to all kinds of immoral behavior. And what I mean by immoral is behavior that's outside the boundaries of what God says is allowable. One of the things that Paul said in writing to Corinthians, he says, everything is lawful for me. And what he meant that isn't that I can do whatever I want with impunity. What he meant that I have the ability to do anything I want. I have that freedom of action and expression. But the point is, he says, but not everything is profitable, not everything is beneficial. In other words, I'm free to do what I want, but those choices sometimes will extract a very high price and cause me a great deal of harm and hardship. And so what Solomon began to explain to his son is, this is the way an immoral person tries to suck you in. And we talked about yesterday how that the flattery of talking about how wonderful you are and how special you are, we call it love bombing. And love bombing is really effective, especially with people who feel unloved, which increasingly is a larger and larger group of people in the world today. And so what we have to have in our own selves is certain boundaries, certain places where we say that's going too far. But in verse 16, though, he continues by talking about how that he begins to appeal to your sensual desires. She says, I have covered my bed with colored linens from Egypt. In other words, this is a luxurious setting. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. It's sensually stimulating to the sight and to the smell and to the taste. And she says, come, let us drink deep of love till morning. Let us enjoy ourselves with love. What she's talking about here is a sensual experience, not a spiritual experience. And what I mean is that it's not really true love. C.S. Lewis wrote a great book called The Four Loves, in which he talked about the different ways the Greeks spoke about loving relationships. They said there was basically the agape love, which is an altruistic love, a person who loves somebody not because of what they can gain from that relationship, but because they are inherently a loving person. In other words, God gives us that agape love. It's the love that comes from him. It's not because it finds pleasure in us, but it finds pleasure in being the expresser of love. And then there's, secondly, he said there's filial love, the love of friendship, the love of affinity. I mean, there's some people we really enjoy being around because we have so much in common and we laugh at the same things and we like to do the same things, Those things create an affinity, a fellowship of people. And many times friendships and community groups are built around this kind of affinity. We all like to get together, hang together. Someone once said that most people attend the church where their 7 best friends attend. I think that's partly true. I know that there have been so many cases where I've seen that somebody in a group will begin to attend a different church and all their friends eventually will go with them to that new church, not because they like it better necessarily, but because that's where their friends are. I mean, it's a human dynamic. It is what it is. That's all I can say. But you see that there's also, he said, there's another kind of love called storge love, the love of a parent for a child. I was reading something yesterday I thought was really quite clever. It says, your husband loves you. He's chosen to love you. Your children love you because you're their mother. Your sisters and siblings love you because you're their sibling. Your parents love you because they're a kid. Well, that's basically storge love. And one of the indications of the end times, we're told by Paul, is that that kind of love will begin to be lost. The natural affection of a parent for a child will begin to dissipate. And so he said that's going to be one of the telltale marks of the collapse of a culture and really the marks of culture in the last days. But then there's Eros love. And Eros love is the love of covetousness, the love of possession. We talk about it being erotic love as being sexual and sensual. And I love one of the things that Lewis said about erotic love or Eros love. He says it's obsessed with consuming, but never allows itself to be consumed. In other words, it seeks to draw as much sensual satisfaction for the one who is the aggressor without any thought or concern for whether or not the other person is sensually affected. And this is kind of a crazy thing because when you enter into a physical intimacy with someone, there is a bonding that takes place between you and that person. It may not be obvious, but there's a connection. And sometimes, especially for women, become very much connected to the person that they have physical intimacy with, unless they become hardened by abuse and having been through the experience too many times. But the reality is that there is an emotional, and God says there's even a spiritual bond. You become one flesh. And when somebody enters into that experience from an Eros perspective, they're having intimacy with you, but they simply want to take out the sexual pleasure from them. And when they're done, they just wipe their hands of you and they move on to the next victim. And that's the kind of thing he's describing here. It's Eros love. There's no agape. There's no philia. There's no even storge affection here. This is just simply a predatorial type of relationship that's not relational intimacy at all, but basically just sexual intercourse. And those two things are a very big difference. A big difference between sexual intercourse and sexual intimacy. In marriage, you're called by God to have sexual intimacy, that sexual interaction draws you closer and closer to that other person, and your love for them goes on a deeper and deeper level. But when people just see sex as an activity, as a form of entertainment or even aggression, then it leaves behind a lot of victims. And that's the problem. And what's interesting is it's not something that we just simply fall into when people say, well, I just fell in love with them and I couldn't help myself. That's really a rationalization that you make up in your own mind. It's not the reality. In fact, James Dobson famously wrote about what he called the 12-step progression into intimacy. And that's going to be either positive or negatively. It's positive if you're doing it with someone you're committed to for the rest of your life. It's negative if you're just simply one and done, or you're going through a sensual experience primarily. But basically what he said is we don't just simply fall into an affair or an illicit relationship. It's something that we progressively move forward into little by little. And our earliest actions may not be overt or intentional, because he began by saying, first of all, he said there's eye to body. In other words, the person looks at the other person's body. It may be only a fleeting glance, and it may notice the physical attributes of that person, and they find those attributes attractive. That's not sin. Sometimes that's just simply appreciation. But it's the problem is when we dwell on that, and we begin to make that a central focus of our mind. Noticing someone is attractive is not sin. It's when you continue to focus on their attractiveness and begin to let your mind go places they shouldn't, that you begin to get in trouble. And that's where it moves into the next phase, where there's eye-to-eye contact, where we meet someone for a second or third time, and we smile at them, and we look at their eyes, and we kind of focus on them for a moment, almost like, I would just want to get closer and nearer to you. And then there's the conversation that we begin to initiate voice-to-voice contacts, where there's initial verbal exchanges. We learn basic bits of information. We're curious about you. And many people are very, very susceptible to this point because they don't have a lot of people who are interested in what's going on in their life. This is also the point where what we call transference begins to happen in counseling sessions, because a man or a woman goes to a counselor of the other sex, sometimes the same sex, and this person is asking questions. They seem interested. They seem concerned. And in their mind, they begin to fantasize, I wish I was married to someone like this. I wish I had somebody this in my life who cared about me and valued me so highly as this person does. And then the next thing is there might be a touching of the hands. Might start with just shaking of the hands, but sometimes you shake the hand, but then you take the other hand in your hand and you just gaze into their eyes and you just tell them how much you love and appreciate them. And it still at this point can be somewhat innocent. It doesn't mean that you're being predatorial, but you realize that you're coming closer to this person, and that's where suddenly you may put your hand on their shoulder. When you begin to put your hand on somebody's shoulders, you begin to embrace them and stuff like that, even the side hugs, that's a deeper level of connection. And it's important for us to realize that we're not to take that too seriously, or nor to indulge our imagination too much because of that event. It doesn't mean they like you or they want you, or necessarily that you like them and you want them. But when it goes to the other parts of the body, when your hand, number 6, begins to touch their waist, now, that is a deliberate gesture of affection. And that's where you begin to move forward into romance. And so, I mean, let's be reasonable. I mean, I will put my arm around the waist of my grandkids and people that I know closely, but not women. But basically, I don't even do that with women who are dear friends of ours. I wouldn't. That's, to me, is a line too far. That's going too far when you begin to touch another person's waist. And because the next thing is that you begin to look at them, not in their eyes, but you begin to look at their breasts. And that glance implies a more focus. When you begin to, especially a man looks at a woman's breast, what it's saying is that I am interested in you physically. I am interested in you sexually. And the next step is really where you transgress. You put your hand on their chest. The next step is mouth to mouth, where you're actually kissing one another. And kissing is such a profound step of intimacy, followed by maybe the mouth on the breast. Then he says, number 11, the hands go to the genitals. And finally, you begin to have genital to genital contact. And when you look at this, you go, these are steps that people go through. And I think that many of us can realize, even if we're talking about our spouses, that we had this kind of progression in our relationship with our wife or husband before we married them. And so that's fine. In fact, that's healthy and good. If you're still kissing after 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you're still embracing and hugging, good for you, and keep doing it. But the whole point is that it doesn't belong anyplace else. And that's where the danger comes in. That's where we transgress. And that's why I say that, and Dobson was really trying to point out, that people don't fall into sexual intimacy. They willingly and they knowingly fall into immorality. And that's the thing we have to admit to ourselves. Well, we'll continue tomorrow. Blessings.